Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
You ever grow up thinking someone in your family was crazy? I'm not talking about your eccentric aunt who collects snow globes or that uncle who drinks too much and sings country songs at Christmas. I mean dangerous crazy. Like, keep the doors locked, don't mention her name, watch what you say around her, crazy. That was my sister Lena. At least, that's who she was to me for most of my life. My parents made sure of it. I was 5 the first time I heard the word unstable. I didn't even know what it meant, but I knew how it felt. Fear. Confusion. Shame. My mom said it like it was contagious, like Lena had caught something you didn't want to be around. I remember sitting on the carpet with my juice box, watching her through the living room window as she was shoved into the back of some old sedan with my dad shouting at her and my mom crying into her hands. I didn't understand what was happening, but I got the message. Lena was trouble, and we don't talk about trouble in this house. They said she was dangerous. They said she hurt people. They said she needed medication, hospitals, structure, control. They said a lot of things over the years, and I believed all of it. Why wouldn't I? I was a kid, and kids believe the adults in the room, especially when they're your parents and they say they're trying to protect you. And honestly, I wanted to believe them. It's easier to think someone's broken than to ask why everything around you feels off and hollow. So I grew up in that house, quiet, tight-lipped, neat. My dad ran the place like a military unit. He had this way of making everything feel like it was your fault. You left a dish in the sink? You were lazy. You forgot to call him when you got home? You were selfish. You cried? You were weak. He didn't yell much, not when we were kids, he didn't have to. He just stared at you with this look like you'd disappointed the last person on earth who might have loved you. My mom, well, she played good cop. She'd pat your hand after he left the room and whisper that you just needed to keep things calm, that he was under a lot of pressure, that we should all be grateful he was still trying. Her favorite line was, "Don't end up like your sister." She said it with this mix of pity and disgust, like Lena had failed some secret test none of us knew we were taking. Lena was gone before I was 6. I didn't hear from her until I was a teenager, and even then, it wasn't really her, it was a weird Christmas card with no return address. Just a generic printed message and her name written in small, shaky letters. My mom found it before I did and tossed it into the trash like it was junk mail. I asked about it once, and she told me Lena was off her meds again, living somewhere unstable, and we were better off not encouraging her delusions. She always made it sound like Lena was dangerous to me specifically, like if I let her into my life, I'd be ruined. By the time I was in my 20s, the idea of reaching out to Lena felt like inviting a bear into your bedroom. You don't do it, not unless you want blood on the floor. And so I stayed away. When people asked about my family, I mentioned my parents, my job, my dog, but never her. Lena was the chapter that got ripped out of the book before anyone could read it. I never questioned it. Not really. Sure, there were moments where something didn't sit right, like when I found an old photo album shoved in the back of the hall closet, filled with pictures of Lena holding me as a baby, smiling, looking completely normal. Or when a neighbor asked how she was doing, and my mom's whole face froze like she'd been caught stealing. Or the time I came home early and heard my parents whispering about her and how it was better this way. But I didn't ask. Because deep down, I'd learned that asking meant trouble. And I wasn't the troublemaker. That was Lena. So I stayed the good daughter. I stayed quiet. I worked a steady job in admin at a healthcare firm. I bought a modest condo 20 minutes from my parents' house. I dated safe guys who never asked too many questions, and I never brought up the past. I visited my folks every Sunday, brought over groceries when they asked, smiled politely when my dad made one of his snide little comments about Lena's latest meltdown he claimed he heard about through some distant cousin. I laughed like it was all fine. Like I didn't feel that weird tug in the pit of my stomach every time her name came up. Then one night, everything snapped. I was 33. It was a Thursday. I was over at their house for dinner. Mom had made this dry meatloaf she always thought was amazing. Dad was 2 whiskeys in and had started doing that thing he does where he tells the same 3 stories from college like they're war tales. I was zoning out, like always, just trying to get through the evening. I must have said something small. I don't even remember what it was. Maybe I disagreed with him about something political, or made a face when he talked about someone from his church. Whatever it was, his face changed. It's hard to explain if you've never seen it, but it was like a switch flipped and he wasn't my dad anymore. His mouth got tight, his eyes narrowed, and suddenly, I felt like I was 12 again, about to get grounded for speaking out of turn. But this time, he didn't just lecture me. He stood up, pushed his chair back hard enough that it scraped the floor. He walked around the table, slowly, like a teacher about to catch a cheating student. And then he said, calmly, "You think you're better than us now, huh?" I laughed, nervously, and told him to relax. That was the last thing I said before he grabbed me by the wrist so hard I dropped my glass and shoved me to the ground. I remember his hand around my throat. I remember the way my mom didn't scream. She just stood there, frozen, like this had happened before, and she'd chosen a long time ago not to stop it. And I remember the knife. How it ended up in his hand, I still don't know, but it was real, and it was close, and I couldn't breathe. And then, out of nowhere, I heard the door slam open so hard it shook the walls, and someone screamed his name. I thought I was hallucinating until I saw her. Lena. Standing in the doorway like something out of a nightmare, but not mine. His. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. She didn't freeze. She charged straight at him, tackled him like she'd been waiting for this moment her whole damn life, and pulled him off me. And just like that, every story they ever told me about her shattered into a million pieces. Tell me this, if someone you've been taught to fear your entire life shows up to save you from the very people who raised you, how the hell are you supposed to live with that? Because I didn't sleep for days after that. And not because of what he did, but because of what it meant. That maybe everything I knew about my family was a lie. When people talk about trauma, they like to focus on the moment, the incident itself, the flash of violence, the sound of something shattering, the split second when everything you thought was safe turns into something you can't come back from. But the truth is, trauma doesn't always hit you in that one clean blow. Sometimes it's slower, messier, more like waking up underwater and realizing you've been drowning for years without even noticing, and that's exactly what the night with my dad felt. Like once the dust started to settle and my body stopped shaking. I sat on the living room floor for a long time after Lena pulled him off me, not because I couldn't move, but because I didn't know how to exist anymore in a space where everything I believed had just been turned inside out in less than a minute. My mother stood in the hallway, half in shadow, staring at us with a blank expression on her face, and I remember locking eyes with her and expecting something, anger, tears, denial, anything, but there was nothing. Just that same look she always wore when my dad lost control, like she'd already decided that silence was her job and she was damn good at it. Lena's voice cut through the silence like a siren, not panicked, not even loud, just steady, furious, controlled. She told me to get my shoes, said we were leaving now, and when I didn't move fast enough, she grabbed my coat from the back of the chair and pulled me to my feet. I wanted to ask her where she'd come from, how she even knew to show up, what she'd been doing all these years, but I couldn't form a single word. I just followed her, stunned and sore, like someone walking away from a burning house with no idea what to do next. Outside, the air hit my face and it was like being slapped awake. Lena threw me into her car, an old, beat-up black sedan that looked like it hadn't had an oil change in a decade, and we drove off without saying a word. I kept looking behind us, expecting my dad to come flying out the door with that knife, or my mom to come running after us crying, begging for forgiveness, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but no one came. The street stayed empty. The porch light flickered behind us. Nothing happened. After 10 minutes of driving in silence, Lena finally spoke, and I swear, her voice sounded older than I remembered, rougher, like life had sanded down every soft edge she used to have. She asked me if I was okay, and I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to ask her why she was even there, how she knew, why she hadn't shown up sooner if she knew what he was capable of, and mostly, why she let me grow up believing she was the monster. But all I could do was whisper, "What just happened?" She let out a laugh, sharp, bitter, not joyful in the slightest, and muttered something like, "You finally saw him, that's what," and then told me she'd been waiting for this day for years. She said she always knew it would happen, that he'd eventually slip up, go too far, that one day I'd see through the bullshit, and that she'd made peace with the fact that she couldn't protect me until I wanted to be protected. That last part hit me like a brick, because deep down, I knew she was right. I'd ignored every gut feeling, every weird memory, every off comment, because it was easier to believe she was crazy than admit that maybe I'd been manipulated my whole damn life. She didn't take me to a hospital, even though I probably should have gone. My neck was bruised, and my wrist was swelling up, but I didn't want doctors or police or any of it. I just wanted to sit somewhere that didn't smell like my dad's cologne. So she drove us to her place, which turned out to be a tiny rented duplex on the edge of town, cluttered and messy and full of mismatched furniture, but it felt safer than anywhere I'd ever been. We sat on her couch for hours, neither of us really knowing how to start the conversation we needed to have. Finally, she got up, brought over 2 mugs of something hot, and said, "I'm not here to say I told you so. But I did try to warn you." And they did the same thing to me. That was the beginning of the real story. That's when the floodgates opened. She told me about the years after she left, how they'd told everyone she was violent, how they made it sound like she was mentally unstable when in reality she'd just refused to stay quiet about the things my dad was doing. She said she started asking questions when she was 15, where the money went, why Mom always had bruises on her arms, why Dad would lock himself in his study for hours at night and come out drunk and raging, and that every time she pushed, they pushed back harder. She said the night she was sent away wasn't some dramatic breakdown. It was my father throwing her down the stairs after she threatened to tell the school counselor what he was doing to her. And when the counselor did ask questions, my mom stepped in and said Lena was delusional, suicidal, needed help. They signed her over to a facility without a single court order. Just a signature and a smile. For a long time, I didn't know how to process any of it. It felt like watching a movie about someone else's life, except every face in the story was mine. I started replaying memories in my head, trying to make them make sense, like the time my dad grounded me for a month because I said I missed Lena, or the time my mom tore up a birthday card she found from her before I could read it. I used to think they were just trying to keep me safe. Now I realized they were keeping me small, obedient, isolated. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't tired, I was wired. Angry, terrified. But underneath all of it, there was something else, clarity. For the first time in my life, the pieces started to fit. The narrative they fed me for years was cracking, and underneath it was something ugly and raw, but real. And I was done pretending I didn't see it. That night didn't break me. It cracked the glass. And when the glass breaks, you don't just sweep it under the rug. You pick it up. You look at what it's reflecting. And then you figure out who the hell you've actually been living with all your life. I didn't go back to their house after that. Not the next day. Not the next week. I didn't answer their calls. I didn't read their messages. And I didn't tell anyone yet. Because before I did anything else, I needed the truth. Not just Lena's version. Not just mine. I needed to dig it up with my own 2 hands, sift through it, lay it out on the table, and see it for what it was. But I knew one thing as clearly as I'd ever known anything in my life. They'd spent years trying to make me think Lena was broken. But it wasn't Lena who was broken. It was them. And they'd taught me how to lie to myself so well that I didn't even know it was happening. Well, I wasn't lying to myself anymore. And I was going to find out exactly how far they'd gone to keep me blind. And then I'd show them what it looks like when their obedient daughter stops playing by their rules. If you've ever had the ground pulled out from under you, not in the physical sense, but in that psychological, gut-twisting way that makes you question the foundation of everything you thought was stable, then you understand what those first few days felt like. Wandering around in my own life like I didn't recognize a single room, a single memory, a single version of myself that hadn't been shaped, twisted, or flat out built from lies. I didn't eat much, didn't sleep more than an hour at a time, and every time I looked at my phone and saw another missed call from Mom or another text from my dad saying things like, "You're confused, sweetheart, come home so we can talk." It was like hearing a stranger use my name in a voice that no longer meant safety, it meant manipulation. Lena kept her distance, not emotionally, but physically, like she knew I needed time to let things settle in my head before I could even begin to piece together a response to what I'd learned. She offered her space, her silence, her honesty, and never once pressured me to believe her version over theirs, which, ironically, made me trust her even more, because unlike our parents, she wasn't trying to steer the narrative, she was just presenting it. Raw and painful and without any attempt to control how I reacted to it. That, in itself, told me more about who she really was than any of the files, accusations, or ghost stories they'd wrapped around her name. But even with her truth staring me in the face, I still had this need, a deeply rooted, almost obsessive need, to confirm it for myself. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I had to see it. I needed physical proof. Something tangible that my brain couldn't argue against when the old programming tried to convince me I was overreacting or imagining things. So I started digging. And once I started, I couldn't stop. The first place I went was the attic in my parents' house, not in person, obviously, because walking back into that place would have been like volunteering for a second round of psychological warfare. But I still had the spare key, and one night, after confirming they were out of town for the weekend visiting friends in Pennsylvania, I drove over, let myself in, and went straight for the attic like I was on a mission I didn't fully understand, but couldn't delay any longer. That attic had always creeped me out as a kid, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because it was off limits. My dad used to say it was too dangerous, that there were exposed nails, unstable beams, mice, mold, but now I saw that for what it was, a giant, padlocked vault of everything he didn't want anyone to find. Inside, it was worse than I remembered, dusty, cluttered, chaotic, but in the corner, under an old tarp, I found a set of plastic tubs labeled Lena, School, and Lena, Medical. That alone should have stopped me, because why the hell would a parent store their kids' medical records in an attic unless they didn't want anyone else to find them? I opened the first tub with shaking hands, and what I found wasn't what I expected. There weren't wild psychiatric files or dangerous diagnoses. There were school transcripts, report cards with straight A's, awards for science fairs and writing contests, notes from teachers that said things like Lena is gifted but seems emotionally withdrawn and shows signs of stress at home. One even wrote that she suspected something wasn't right and had called my parents multiple times with no response. The second tub hit even harder. It wasn't just hospital bills, it was letters. Letters Lena had written to me over the years, dozens of them, all sealed, never opened, tucked between manila envelopes and copies of invoices for a mental health facility that had billed for only 30 days. Not the year and a half they'd claimed she was institutionalized. The letters were heartbreaking. She wrote about missing me, about how confused she was, about how no one would tell her where I was or how I was doing. She kept saying, "Don't believe them. Just ask me when you're ready. I'll always be here." I sat in that attic for hours, reading every single word, flipping through documents, piecing together a timeline that didn't line up with the one I'd been told. According to the papers I found, Lena wasn't sent away because she hurt someone. She was sent away because she filed a report. At 16, she told a teacher that our dad was hitting her and threatening Mom. She gave details, dates, bruises. And the teacher followed protocol. CPS got involved. But somehow, some way, the whole thing disappeared, and Lena disappeared with it. The deeper I went, the more furious I became, not just at them, but at myself. Because even when I'd felt the dissonance growing up, even when something didn't sit right, I'd ignored it. I'd let them twist reality because it was more comfortable to accept their version than to dig for the truth. But now the truth was here, stacked in front of me, and I couldn't unsee it. The narrative they'd built was a carefully crafted illusion, supported by silence, fear, and just enough partial truth to make it believable, but behind it was nothing but control. I took pictures of everything. Every document. Every letter. Every receipt. I didn't know what I was going to do with them yet, but I needed them out in the open, away from that dark attic, away from the smell of mildew and lies. I left the house without touching anything else. Locked the door behind me. Drove back to Lena's and walked in with a box full of her stolen life, and for the first time, I saw her face crack, not with anger or sadness, but with relief. Because finally, someone else had seen it too. And as we sat on her floor, surrounded by decades of proof, I told her what I knew now with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going back. Not just to their house, but to them. To their story. To their reality. I was done being the good daughter, the quiet girl, the one who nodded and smiled while they buried the truth under guilt and manipulation. I was going to burn the whole illusion to the ground. But not with fire. With facts. With timing. With precision. Because they'd trained me to be silent, obedient, predictable. But what they never saw coming was that one day, their perfect little daughter would become just like the sister they tried to erase. And I wasn't going to just walk away. I was going to end it. But first, I was going to make sure they never saw it coming. There's something darkly poetic about using the very tools your abusers handed you to dismantle the empire they built. Something so cold and calculated about turning their rules back on them and making them watch as you beat them at their own game without raising your voice, without threatening a thing, without even breaking the law, and that's exactly what I decided to do. Because once I saw the truth laid out in Lena's letters, in the hospital bills that didn't match their stories, in the school records that showed a girl trying to survive instead of a girl falling apart, I realized I didn't just want distance from them. I didn't just want to move on or cut ties or go to therapy until the memories softened into something manageable. I wanted them to lose everything they valued, everything they used to control others, and I wanted them to know, without a single doubt, that the fall came from the one daughter they thought they had under control. I didn't rush it, and that was the key, because people like my parents don't fall from a push, they fall from weight, from slow and careful pressure applied to every weak spot they've tried to cover for decades, and the first weak spot was their image. You see, my dad had spent years building this carefully curated version of himself for the community, a church-going man who coached youth baseball when I was younger, who spoke at town council meetings, who donated just enough money to local causes to be seen as a good guy without anyone asking questions. My mother played support, always present, always smiling politely, always echoing whatever version of events he gave to others, and it worked, because small towns believe what they're shown, especially when you show it with confidence and consistency. So I started with that image, not by publicly accusing them or storming into Sunday service screaming about abuse, but by planting seeds, quiet, subtle, undeniable seeds that made people start asking questions on their own. I emailed a copy of one of Lena's letters, just one, to the pastor of their church, a man who had known our family for over 20 years and had probably heard more lies than sermons over that time. I didn't sign it. I didn't accuse. I just included the letter and a short message. If you knew this about one of your congregation, would you still sit next to him in prayer? And then I left it alone. Next, I reached out to the old neighbor who used to babysit me when I was a kid, a woman named Joan who'd always had this soft spot for me, who once told me, when I was maybe 10, that Lena wasn't nearly as crazy as they said, and that I should always keep my heart open to people who'd been pushed out. I called her, told her the truth, showed her what I'd found, and asked her one simple favor. If people started talking, would she be willing to say, truthfully, that she'd seen bruises on my mom, that she remembered hearing fights through the walls, that she never once saw Lena act out but often saw her crying alone on the porch? She agreed instantly, like she'd been waiting for years to speak up, just needed someone to open the door. I did the same with one of my high school teachers, a counselor who'd written a note in Lena's file about her seeming stressed and unsupported at home. She remembered Lena. She remembered my father showing up to a meeting uninvited and intimidating her into silence. I showed her the documentation, and she was horrified, not just because of what she read, but because of how little it surprised her. She said if anything ever came up officially, she'd speak on the record. I told her I hoped it wouldn't come to that, but I needed her to be ready. I wasn't trying to build a legal case, not really, because deep down I knew the system wasn't going to be what gave me justice. What I was building was social collapse, the kind of quiet storm that starts with whispers, spreads with side glances, and ends with a community that no longer trusts the people it once applauded. I knew how much my dad valued control, not just of us, but of his reputation, and I knew that the moment cracks started to show in that perfect little picture he'd painted, he'd panic, and people who panic make mistakes. I also started pulling away from their financial web, because one of the things Lena warned me about was how they used money to control behavior, and she was right. They hadn't paid my bills, but they'd offered help when I bought my condo, co-signed the loan, and regularly reminded me how grateful I should be for that support. So I went to the bank, refinanced the place in my name only, and sent my parents a polite email saying I appreciated their help in the past, but would be managing everything on my own going forward. My dad replied within the hour, short and cold, "This is a mistake. We only ever wanted to help you." That was the moment I knew he could feel it, the slipping, the unraveling. But the part that made it personal, the part that made it hurt, came next. I took the evidence I had, copies of Lena's letters, timelines, receipts, school records, even a voice recording I found on an old tape Lena had kept from a call where my mom admitted she just needed things to stay quiet, and I printed it all. Put it in a binder. Simple. Clean. Unmistakable. Then I mailed it. Not to the police. Not to the press. But to my mother. Just her. No return address. No message. Just the truth unwrapped. Because I wanted her to read it alone. I wanted her to sit in the same silence she'd weaponized against both of her daughters for decades and feel what it was like when that silence finally broke. I didn't need to hear her deny it. I didn't want another manipulative conversation where she cried and twisted things and made herself the victim. I wanted her to see, on paper, that everything she'd covered for, everything she'd ignored, everything she'd helped bury, was no longer hidden. I wanted her to know, without question, that I knew and that I had proof. And I waited. The fallout didn't take long. Within 2 weeks, my dad stepped down from the church finance board for personal reasons. Within a month, 3 of their oldest friends had stopped returning their calls. I heard through Joanne that people had started to whisper about what really happened with Lena, and that more than one person had confronted my mom about the binder. She denied it, of course, said it was lies, but she didn't sound convincing, and the more she tried to control the narrative, the faster it spun away from her. The best part? I hadn't said a single word in public. I hadn't posted anything online. I hadn't shown my face in town. I was the ghost behind the curtain, watching their carefully constructed lives unravel like a cheap sweater. And the more they tried to tighten their grip, the more obvious it became to everyone that something was wrong, that the cracks weren't new, they'd just been painted over. They taught me silence. They taught me obedience. They taught me how to play small and keep secrets and smile when it hurt. But they forgot one very important thing. If you raise someone in a cage long enough, the second she learns the lock was never real, she doesn't just run. She builds her own set of keys. And I wasn't just unlocking my life, I was coming for everything they thought was untouchable. Because they never expected me to become the one thing they feared most. A daughter who knew the truth and wasn't afraid to use it. If there's one thing people like my parents can't handle, it's losing control over the story. They'll do anything, twist anything, burn down their own dignity and yours too if that's what it takes to keep the spotlight pointed exactly where they want it. And the most dangerous moment for people like that isn't when someone starts asking questions. It's when the person they've spent their entire life shaping, silencing, and scripting finally decides to speak on her own terms, in her own voice, and no longer plays the part they assigned her decades ago. That moment, the one where I stopped being the good daughter and started being the mirror they couldn't look into, was the one they never saw coming, and by the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late to crawl back into the fantasy they'd lived in for so long. What I didn't expect, though, was how fast their collapse would start feeding on itself. Once the silence broke, once those first whispers turned into real conversations behind closed doors, it wasn't just me and Lena watching the empire crack, it was people they'd known for years, people they counted on to defend them without question. People who started putting their own memories together and realizing that things never added up. Not really. Like the friend from church who remembered my dad once screaming at Lena in the parking lot and then laughing it off like it was a teenage tantrum. Or the old coworker of my mom's who used to ask why she always wore long sleeves in the summer. Or the former school counselor who admitted, years later in a private message, that there had been concerns about our home, but every attempt to investigate had been met with charm and dismissal and closed doors. I didn't need revenge that looked like a movie scene. I didn't need screaming confrontations or public meltdowns. I needed something far quieter and much more final. I wanted them to live in the consequences of their own actions. Not as villains in someone else's story, but as stripped-down, exposed versions of themselves, with no audience left to applaud the roles they'd rehearsed for so long. And I got exactly that, not through rage, not through violence, but through precision and patience and a refusal to be manipulated 1 second longer. When my mother finally really called me, not the vague voicemails or the hollow texts pretending none of it had happened, I didn't answer. I let it ring again and again, because I didn't need to hear her try to control the conversation or beg for understanding or offer another half apology wrapped in guilt and conditions. Instead, I wrote her a letter, not out of obligation, not for closure, but because I wanted the last word, and I wanted it to land without interruption, without deflection, without tears or tone or manipulation. I told her that I knew everything, that I had seen it all, read it all, heard the things she'd whispered when she thought no one was listening. I told her that the worst part wasn't what they did to Lena or even what my father did to me, but what she allowed, year after year, under the banner of keeping peace and protecting appearances. I told her I didn't hate her, but I would never trust her again, and I didn't owe her a seat at my table just because. She gave birth to me. And then I ended it with a truth she could never rewrite. You spent your life covering for him. I'm spending the rest of mine uncovering what you tried to bury. And I sent that letter, not by mail, but by hand, through a friend who slipped it into her mailbox while I waited across the street in my car. Not because I was afraid of her reaction, but because I wanted to see the moment she read it. The moment her face changed, the moment her fingers gripped the edge of the paper, and she realized there was nothing she could do to stop what was already done. And when she looked up, scanned the street like she was searching for someone, I didn't flinch, didn't hide, didn't drive away. I just looked back, calm, unmoved, and waited until she turned and walked back into that house that no longer had any power over me. Lena and I didn't become instant best friends. We didn't fall into some Hallmark reunion fantasy where everything was suddenly okay and years of trauma dissolved under a hug and a glass of wine. It was awkward at first, clumsy even, with both of us unsure how to move forward without stepping on the old landmines we'd inherited from a family that built its entire identity on fear and control. But what we did have, what we rebuilt, slowly and with effort, was trust. Real trust. The kind that comes not from shared blood, but from shared survival, from two women who had been broken in different ways by the same machine and who now, finally, had the freedom to figure out who they were without someone else pulling the strings. We talked about everything. The nights she cried herself to sleep in that facility, thinking I'd abandoned her. The days I spent staring at the photo of us on the fridge, wondering if she was still alive. The guilt we both carried, even though none of it was ours to carry in the first place. And little by little, through tears and silence and awkward laughter, we started to understand what it meant to be sisters again, not because someone told us we should, but because we chose to try. My dad didn't reach out. Not once. Not after the attack. Not after the binder. Not after his reputation started unraveling in the town he used to walk through like a king. And that silence, after everything, was its own confession. Because cowards don't apologize. They retreat. They lie in the beds they made and blame the world for the fact that no one wants to visit them anymore. And I'm okay with that. I don't need his words. I don't need his guilt. I don't need his shame. I just need the distance. And the knowledge that he no longer controls the narrative, not in my life, not in Lena's, not in anyone's. The last time I drove by their house, months after everything had fallen apart, the porch was dark, the blinds were drawn, the pain on the side starting to peel just a little at the edges. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel anything. Not anger. Not sadness. Not fear. Just nothing. And that nothing felt like freedom. They spent their whole lives telling me that Lena was broken, unstable, unsafe, a threat to herself and everyone around her. And for so many years, I swallowed that lie like it was medicine, let it shape how I saw her, how I saw myself, how I let them treat me. But now, looking back, I realized something so simple, so clear, it almost makes me laugh. Lena wasn't the unstable one. She was just the first one who refused to stay quiet. And I was the fool who believed silence was strength, that obedience was love, that loyalty meant swallowing your own voice just to keep the peace in a war you didn't start. But not anymore. Now I know better. And they know it too. Because they thought I was still the fool. But I was the weapon they built with their own hands. And I used every lesson they ever taught me to finally destroy them.